This video is brought to you by Squarespace, but we are going to talk about that later. So, are you the kind of person that likes pizza? Then content warning, because this is about to gross you out. It's a Blender pizza. That's what we're doing today. It is the dumbest tutorial we have done, but sneak peek. We are going to be doing something with it in a different tutorial, so we need to make the pizza to, do the thing. Get ready for some GeoNodes. This one's medium to advanced, I would say. But look at that. It's not too bad. It even has the cuts and everything. Okie dokie. Let's make the thing, preferably in full screen. Here we do it. Okay. We are going to delete everything but the cube. Now, this one's going to be a bit long, so I'm going to try to, just kind of get through it. As I don't even click it. Cube, make it a GeoNodes object, and we are going to replace it with a grid. And the idea is this grid, which is a square, we are going to put the Blender logo on and then do operations on it. So to do that, we are going to need a lot more geometry. Let's say 100 by 100. I'm then going to bring in our Blender texture information. So to prep for this tutorial, I brought in a Blender logo image and also a cardboard image. To view this, we can use the viewer. You can see this is what it looks like, but it's actually offset by 0.5 on the X and Y axes. And this is because we're using position coordinates and our grid is centered. So it uses this as the bottom left corner, basically. And if I was to kind of clip it, you can see what's going on. To fix this, I'm going to use a position node, and I'm just going to offset it. So let's see. Yes, so I want to add by 0.5 on both axes, and now we have our thing. Notice that the resolution's a little wonky, and that is dependent exactly on our grid, which is why you might want a lot of geometry. Okay, next order of operations. We need to cut out everything that isn't the Blender logo, so all these chunks. Now, luckily for us, we do have a bit of a shortcut where this image comes with an alpha. So I would download the one with the alpha, but then we have a second kind of problem where I want to delete this white ring. So not going to be the easiest thing, but here's how we're going to do it. So we want to get rid of geometry. So I'm going to delete geometry where the alpha is, which is going to give us the inverse, because we're saying wherever the Blender logo is, get rid of it. Well, that's not what we want. So I'm going to invert it. Taking 1 minus it is kind of flipping the Boolean, making true false and false true. And there we go. Turns out that alpha is a little glitchy if it's not perfectly white or something, which is why 1 doesn't seem to work. Okay, next order of business is how do we get rid of the white ring? You might be thinking, okay, it's a perfect circle, so we can measure the radius here, and then also the blue radius, and say only in the area in between do we delete, and that is valid, but notice that this isn't even centered relative to the origin, so that might be a bit of extra work. Instead, I can just ask, where is this image white? Okay, I'm not going to use greater than. Instead, I'm going to actually compare the colors. So I take the color input, that's the image, and I'm going to get the distance. In other words, how different is it from the vector 1, 1, 1? That represents white. It's 100% red, 100% green, 100% blue, such that we are taking the color and comparing it to the color white, which will output different values depending on these 3 colors. We expect the white area to equal 0. And the reason for that is they're exactly the same, so there's no distance. So let's see if that is true. So I'm going to slightly increase this, and yeah, you can see we've isolated it. Again, it wasn't pure white, which is why, we had to change the number a little. But that's perfect, because now I can also delete this geometry just by adding this component. Okay, so I'm saying delete based on both these rules. You can decide how you want to delete based on points or faces. That's not what I wanted. Or faces. That is up to you, but I think points kind of gives us the crisp edge. Okay, we're making progress. So now the question is, did I invert this again? Do I want to subtract this? All. Okay, there we go. So now the question is, we have our kind of cutout. How do we turn it into pizza? Well, we're going to have 3 steps. Step 1 is we're actually going to make crust around this. So not only do we need to kind of isolate the image, but we need to extract its edge. So we're going to talk about how to do that. We're going to make crust. Second of all, we're going to turn this into a pizza with distortion and all this. And third of all, it's going to be a pepperoni pizza, so we need to distribute points. And all of this, everything, is based on this mesh that we have right here. So I can turn that into a node group with Control G. Okay, and we'll call that cutout. And let's save. By the way, this is obviously going to be available on Patreon. Link somewhere. Promotion. Okay, so we have our cutout. Now the question is, how do we get the boundary? This ridiculous pizza tutorial is sponsored by Squarespace, which has been a sponsor of the channel for years now, so thank you for that. If you don't know what Squarespace is, it is pretty much the easiest and the most visually appealing, instantly way to make a website, and here are 3 features you might find interesting. Right out of the box, you get analytics, so you know who is coming to your website. Second of all, you get a content library, which you can think of as kind of like a drive in the cloud, so you don't need to keep all your files locally. And then third of all, like I said, it's very intuitive to make the website. You just drag around things. If you wanted to inject HTML, I guess that's a thing you could do. So if this is something you're interested in, go to squarespace.com, make a website, and when you're ready to take that thing live, link in the description. Save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So here's my method for selecting the boundary. There might be a cleaner approach, but this makes sense to me. So clearly, we want to isolate kind of this like jagged staircase boundary edge. But the question is, how do we know a boundary edge, from a interior edge? Well, if you think about it, what's different is there's empty space to the side of it. That's how we know one from the other. Another way to describe that is every single edge, let's say we're looking at this edge, has a number of faces it's contributing to. So this edge is contributing to this face and this face, made a division sign, whereas this edge is only contributing to a single face. So in other words, we can kind of isolate edges, not perfectly, based on how many faces they are touching. Luckily, there's a node for this. So I'm going to use face neighbors, which tells us the face count and the vertex count. I don't know if I need to necessarily evaluate this on the edge domain. This is basically saying, tell me how many faces, is it like neighboring, but make sure we're talking about edges. May or may not be relevant, but either way, I'm now going to delete geometry again for a separation based on this. So our face count, I'm going to check where it's greater than a certain number. So if I plug this in, it's going to delete everything because every single edge at least has 0 faces next to it, of course. So as I increase this, okay, so now you can kind of see what we were going for. And then that is actually pretty clean. In fact, we kind of have this bridge over here and also over here, wherever there are sharp corners. So let's see if we can get around this without extra work. We're going to go to our cutout. Remember, we have a certain resolution for this, which actually is the resolution of this boundary. Can we bring this up? We can, but it doesn't necessarily fix this issue. But we can make the gap smaller and smaller and smaller. Maybe we can use an approach like this and combine it with like a second layer of filtering. So we've made the gap super tiny. And now what we can do is we can merge by distance. This is basically going to say if 2 points are within a threshold of each other, merge them, connect them. And this is exactly what we want to bridge the edges. Okay, so you want to play around with this distance value to get the best results. Luckily for me, I don't need this to be a super clean curve in my case. It's kind of a shame that it's hard to find the exact numbers. I mean, you can kind of stack these on top of each other. Okay, I think I found the number that seems to work. It's 0.0155. Again, depending on your shape, it doesn't have to be the Blender logo. Your mileage may vary. But this means we now have a cutout, and we also have the boundary, which we can also turn into a node group. So this is going to be boundary. You're not going to be cursed with the messy node group that I had. So Let's turn this boundary into crust. Easiest way to do that is we're going to kind of sweep a circle around it. So I'm going to run a mesh to curve, which will make this easier because now we have this as curve information that we can bring back into a mesh. So send it to a curve, send it back to a mesh, but now with the upside of letting us like sweep it with a second curve, which gives us something like that. It's kind of like the curve, Bezier curve feature like in Stock Blender where you can pick the depth and the bevel. This is good enough for us. Don't need that much resolution. And we kind of want to pick the average size of the crust, maybe something like that. And notice I said average size of the crust because I want some parts to be thicker than others. I want to add variation. And I'm going to do that very simply by changing the curve radius, which you can see it does kind of the same thing as changing the radius of our profile curve. Well, if we set the curve radius to be subject to a random kind of, situation, a noise texture, it's a little hard to see now, but if we increase this influence, and I guess also kind of change up the scale, now you can see that we've actually messied up our crust, which actually looks pretty good. You can play around with these numbers. I do feel like it should be low detail. That looks pretty good to me. And again, you can change the average size by bringing up that radius, maybe not by that much, 25%. Okay, great. So now we have the crust object, which you can add a second level of detail to. I don't think I really want that. I think I can do that in the normal map that we'll talk about later. But again, remember, this is our variation and this is our average. One thing I'm seeing is it kind of looks too like ribbed. So you can get rid of that by bringing down the detail and very importantly by bringing down the roughness. Okay. Final thing. I'm going to add a 4D noise, which will let us kind of pick our crust procedurally. I guess this crust is a bit too thick, so something like that. We can go back to it. Okay, so we got our pizza, we got our crust. Now let's make our pepperoni. Remember, we have this nice cutout where we can distribute points on the surface. Each point is going to represent pepperoni. If we have a lot of points, it's basically going to outline the shape. However, no two pepperoni, I guess, should intersect each other. Like, normally that's how it's done. I guess you could have one on top of the other. So I'm going to change to Poisson disc. What that does is it makes sure that no 2 points are in a certain distance of each other. And we can change what that distance is by bringing this up, bringing that up, and now you can see they're not intersecting. So let's make pepperoni. I'm going to do this super simply. You're going to think I'm crazy starting with a cone, but I'll show you why I'm starting with a cone as opposed to something like a mesh circle, which we'll talk about in a second. So mesh circle just kind of gives me a circle, a single face, and gone. You can turn that into a fan. The reason I'm not doing that is a cone gives us more control where I can add side segments and then basically turn this into a circle. I'll show you what I mean. So here we have a cone. I do not want this bottom, or you could do the reverse, but I do not want this bottom. So I'm going to delete geometry by faces and get rid of the bottom, okay? So we've hollowed this out, and then you might guess what I'm gonna do next if we take the cone and kind of flatten it on the Z axis. So scale by 0. Now what we've effectively done is kind of taken the cone, kind of exploited its geometry and flattened it to get a circle that we have more control over. And additionally, we can, like we're doing for everything, we can distort it. So set position changes positions of points. I'm going to distort it by noise. You know the drill by this point, hopefully. If you haven't seen some of my tutorials, check them out. I always talk about how noise texture, we need to subtract 0.5 because that's the average value. So we need to recenter it by bringing it backwards. And then finally, we are going to scale this effect. Something like that. You can kind of pick the texture in some sense of your pepperoni. but that looks pretty good to me. We're going to set shade smooth, and now this, Control G, is our pepperoni. Pepperoni? I'll be honest, I do not know how to spell that word. Okay. So clearly we have a point distribution and we have pepperoni, and I want to map one to the other such that we instance on points. Each point gets an instance of the pepperoni. Great. They're too big, so I'm going to take the scale and not only shrink it, but randomize it. So we get kind of 2 in 1. If I randomize it and bring down the maximum, you can see we have a pepperoni that's smaller, but also randomized. In fact, we first of all should set a maximum size and then kind of make the minimum only slightly smaller so that there's variation, but it's not crazy. So here you can see what we have here. And to see this in context, let's take our cutout, join them. Okay, we're seeing an issue here, but also join the crust. So you can see the 3 components. Last thing I'm going to do before we fix this is I'm just going to bring these points up a little so we can see them. So the main thing you're seeing is I think the proportion's fine, but all the pepperoni look exactly the same. They're different sizes, but you can see this wrinkling is the same as this wrinkling, is the same as this one. But more importantly, the pepperoni is jutting out of the pizza because we're distributing points on this cutout, but why can't it have a point on the very, very boundary, which is not what we want? So we need it to generate points, but not near the boundary. Remember, we do have a boundary node. In other words, what I can do is I can distribute points on faces, but not in a certain area. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to use geometry proximity, which will tell us how close are our points, how close are our cutouts to a certain boundary edge. Okay, so let me explain. I'm going to set geometry proximity to edges. It's going to see where is the nearest edge of the boundary, and if it's very close, in other words, the distance is less than a really small number, it's really close, then it should not do it. Now, I might have just done the inverse, but we'll find out. Okay. So I'm going to increase this. Does it even care about what I did? Okay, here we go. So I think I just did the reverse. I'm saying basically only keep points that are on the edge. So I think I want to invert this, make that greater than. Okay, cool. So again, we have a bunch of points, and it's going to get rid of the ones on the edge, and we can compensate by generating more points and allowing them to be slightly closer to each other so that we can have more. Okay, great. If you don't like the look of this, just change the seed to get a different look. I happen to like seed 0. Okay, so we got our pepperoni. Next order of business is the pizza is flat, right? The actual cheese and tomato part. I'm going to distort it, but then, of course, we have this issue where we also need to distort the pepperoni. How do we want to do that? I guess we could distort them together, might be a choice. Let's consider that. So I'm going to take our pepperoni. I'm going to turn them into a mesh, so they're not just instances, but they have mesh data, so we can manipulate them. And I am going to join this with the cutout, such that we only have the cutout and the pepperoni, but no crust. If I then have the pepperoni slightly above the pizza, like we do, and by the way, we'll make the pepperoni look different in a second, but I set position, in other words, I'm going to distort it. Let's say we only do it up and down. So I'm going to take the noise texture, and I'm going to offset it only on the Z component. So I'm saying take a source of randomness, but only move it up and down like a height field, connect that to the offset, and clearly what we wanted. Take this and make it smaller. Again, just like the three-dimensional noise, you want to center it by subtracting by 0.5. So before, after, and then bring down the scale of that. So in theory, it should give us the pizza distortion while also distorting the pepperoni and keeping it on top. What is this tutorial? Okay. And then only after that can we also join the crust. And we should have a bit of give because the crust is thick, so it doesn't matter if the pepperoni goes slightly above or below, but we can kind of moderate this. Okay. And at this point, of course, you can just kind of play around with numbers, see what looks good to you. Of course, you can also randomize this to get a seed that you like. Pepperoni is a little too high, just a little. Remember, we had this like offset. If I divide by 2, we just don't want it intersecting. That's pretty good, in my opinion, though there's just the tiniest bit of intersection. Okay. Actually, no, it wasn't intersecting. Okay, so we have our mesh. You could argue that maybe we should have more detail in this noise. We have our mesh. Of course, there's more we can manipulate here, like adding detail to this crust and stuff like that. But we should probably move over to just modifying this crust. We should probably move over to shading, where this is really going to come into its own, as it were. So to make this work, we're going to need 3 materials, 1 for the cheese and tomato, 1 for the pepperoni, and 1 for the crust. And each one's actually going to be pretty similar. So I'm going to set material. First of all, I'm going to do 1 for our cutout. That's this. Next of all, I don't know why that sounded weird to me. Next of all, it just doesn't sound right. I'm going to do 1 for the pepperoni. So remember, we have a pepperoni mesh. And then thirdly, 1 for the boundary. Okay, we have 3 materials. And actually, before I do that, I promise I'd vary up the pepperoni. To do that, how do we? I want to do that. We have random scale. Let's also add random rotation on the z-axis. So from the z top view, it's only rotating clockwise or counterclockwise. We can do that by plugging this into rotation. Again, you can see what's wrong with this, so make sure it's only on the z-axis and give it some spin. That already makes it look pretty varied, but if that's not enough for you, you can make a second pepperoni. And I guess you could kind of make 2 options and pick the instance. Do I want to do that? Let's try it. So I'm going to make a second pepperoni group. I'm going to click this so that they're separate. For this one, I'm just going to change the W, which we can't see yet since we haven't done anything with it. But I believe we can do what I'm thinking by making each pepperoni its own instance. So let's see. Yeah, geometry to instance. Let's see if that's what we want. I don't know if we can do this in a single node. It seems like we can, but I'm not 100% sure if it gives us what we want. So I'm going to give the pepperoni material to both that are slightly different. And then I'm going to join them. And then, so right now it's instancing. Can I have it pick instance? It's a little hard to tell, but I think that's the case. We can tell by just having some of them be cubes. Okay, so you can see some of them are cubes, some of them are pepperoni, which means we have 2 different pepperonis. Pepperoni. Okay, great. So we have variation. Now let's do a material, right? Yeah. Okay, so here's what's up. We need 3 materials. 1 should be crust, 1 should be cheese, 1 should be pepperoni, which I do not know how to spell. It's so close, but I know it's wrong. So pepperoni, cheese, remember, crust, remember in geometry nodes land, you need to assign your materials as a node. Had some corn. Just because. So for this, we know this is the crust. You just got to kind of remember what's going on. The cutout is the cheese. And then for pepperoni, we have 2 of these variations. And now we have our materials that we should play around with just to make sure. Let's modify the crust. Beautiful. And the pepperoni. Beautiful. Okay. Before we get too deep into this, I just want to make sure we have a nice lighting setup. And it turns out that I do not, and you'll see why. So I'm going to add an HDRI, and you're thinking, okay, swell. We like HDRI lighting. The issue is I don't have any interior HDRIs, you know? Well, we could just get one, right? Because the thing is, you normally see pizza, so HDRI Haven, You normally see pizza in the context of an indoor setting. So I'm going to go to indoor. Which one of these would you eat a pizza in? I almost want it to be a restaurant. This one's okay. But yeah, literally they have HDRIs for free. That one's okay. That one's okay. Is there like... Okay, here we go. Man's working in his workshop, wants a pizza. That's correct. Okay, so I'm going to download an EXR. You can make it 4K, or I think even 8K. I'm not sure, but I'm going to save that as an HDRI. Make sure it's an EXR so you get that extra dynamic range. 24K, dear fucking God. Okay, let's refresh this. Now we have the workshop. And okay, this is already looking, I mean, not good, but it's looking like something. You know, the lighting is doing something in my tummy. So let's get rid of this background so I don't need to see it. And now we're going to do one material at a time. The easiest is the pepperoni. Pepperoni should be kind of this orangish red. And I know it looks like Play-Doh, but I'm going to show you the trick to this. You want to make it shiny because it's kind of oily. And I guess also we should have it have a bit of thickness even though it's super thin. So let me just do this in a moment. I'm going to realize instances. I'm going to extrude. So here you can see the pepperoni. Make sure you disable individual so you can get just the tiniest bit of extrusion. It really doesn't like that, does it? 0.001. Okay, there we go. So this is without, this is with. So I'm just giving it the tiniest bit of thickness. Doesn't matter. So pepperoni is this. It's shiny. The secret, there are two, but the main secret, make sure we view everything. The main secret to getting food, whether it be pepperoni or whatever, to look realistic in general is subsurface, in my opinion. You take subsurface, you bring it up, and all of a sudden, I know it's not 100% there, but it all of a sudden looks a bit more edible, at least to me, right? And obviously, we need to play around with the color, but that looks substantially better. So here's without. It looks like Play-Doh. This is with. This is the secret, in my opinion. I always say this. So next detail bump we can do is I'm just going to add some normal mapping for free. Bring up your scale. It's distorted because our coordinate system is distorted and its instance. Point is, you want to make sure you're using object coordinates, okay? Such that you can now drive a bump node to create a normal map. And this is before and after, okay? And let's bring up the scale. Maybe bring down the scale. Bring up the roughness, the detail, and bring down the strength. So this is just going to add a second layer of texture, a bump, if you will, which I think makes it look a lot better. You can also, I guess you could also vary the color of the pepperoni if you wanted to get into it. Let's see. So we have a geometry nodes, a geometry node, but not the procedural one, that has random per island. As you can see, each pepperoni now has its own ID in some sense, such that now I can make them a little different. So just going to plug this in here, substitute it in. So you can see some pepperoni is brighter than others. So I am just going to multiply. If I multiply by black, you can see some of them get quite dark, which kind of looks better almost. But I'm going to do something like this, just so they don't all look exactly the same. And maybe something to consider is a saturation bump, because pizza is deep fried. So either way, that looks pretty good to me. Okay. And I think it will make more sense in context. So for the cheese, we're actually going to do something quite similar. You could... So I was just going to add a noise texture to mix cheese and tomato. But I guess like you see some of this is already bumpy. So maybe it should kind of correspond with that. Well, let's see. We might bail on this. But if I wanted to do this, I can store... Yeah. I can store an attribute. So I'm going to store the noise texture. I'm going to call this height. So now you can see we have height information. Most of this is 0. but you can see we get some different numbers. Our pizza, and I guess also our pepperoni, will now have this attribute. Oh, I guess I want this one. That one? I don't know. But we have this attribute that in theory we can use to drive some stuff. So if I write height, we get, it's a little hard to tell, but we get that same noise texture. I don't think I'm actually going to end up using this. Maybe. But you can kind of see what's going on here. So the idea is we now mix two colors. Let's say black represents tomato and white represents cheese. So let's do something like that for cheese, kind of like a bright tomato. Again, this is supposed to be deep fried. Plug that in here, view it. Remember, it's pretty reflective because all of this is very greasy. And then also our secret of subsurface. It kind of makes sense, but clearly it looks dull. And I think the issue is our noise texture isn't detailed enough. So maybe if we want to store this, it's fine, but it should have more detail and maybe more roughness. I don't know if that's what I want. Let's see. No, that is it. That was actually it. Okay, that clearly looks better than what we had before. Don't worry, we're going to do more to this. I'm going to bump the saturation by outsourcing it to a node to kind of give it that deep fried look. So before, after, if you can't tell, this is what it looks like with stupid high saturation. One thing I'm seeing is the pepperoni looks a bit too big, so it's kind of this back and forth. We have a random scale. Let's have them go down a little in size. I mean, this isn't a normal type of pizza, you know, but whatever. Okay, before editing this is a good start. Let's finish up with our crust. So just to get kind of a look, let's pick a crusty kind of color. Kind of bright, actually. So something like that. Again, our secret is subsurface. Although this one's coming out a little green. You could think about why, or you could just kind of play around with these numbers to change the color. Each one represents like how much red, green, or blue is passing through. But I'm not going to think about it too much. Okay, so that's okay for a start. I think another thing is clearly we should add a passive noise texture, just like we're doing with most of these. So noise texture, by default, it's distorted. But in this case, do we want to keep that, right? Like I could switch to object coordinates, which, you know, are evenly distributed. But do I want that? Let's try it like this. So if I was to use this as a noise texture, run it through height, and view that, nah. I mean, I guess most of this is a subsurface issue, but I don't think that's it, is it, right? So let's change to object coordinates, which are going to be a bit better. Again, we'll get rid of that green in a second. But I'm just going to pick some numbers, something like that. Bring up the detail, bring up the roughness. We want it to look like, you know, baked, but not necessarily like a rock. But okay, so it's green, right? That is a result of subsurface. But I want subsurface. So we're kind of in this dilemma here. We're in this dilemma. I think probably the way to solve this is to figure out exactly, like I said, what subsurface number works for us. It's going to be a bit of a balance. Again, you could actually think through what these numbers represent, but I am not. I'm just dragging sliders to my heart's content. Okay, so that's a bit better, but let's see, without, with. Okay, so we're getting some of the benefit without like making it super green. I mean, again, it's a balance. It's a balance. Which of these is causing the green? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But I guess there's also other settings I never play with, like the scale and the anisotropy. I don't know what these do, to be frank with you. But clearly, that ain't it. What does anisotropy do? Don't know. Okay, for now, I'm just going to make the effect a bit softer so that you can't tell that it's green. Nah, that ain't it, boys. That ain't it. Okay, We'll figure it out. But this is a good start to our crust. Obviously, it looks like a rock. So I'm going to bring down the strength of our normal map. And kind of the hard part I've found is to get the right color for the crust. I think it's a saturation issue. Yeah, it needs to look more deep fried. But looking at reference, so let me actually show you some reference. Looking at reference, you'll probably have forgotten that there is something extra to the pizza crust. There's all these, let's see, here we go. There's all these kind of puffy areas and kind of burned marks. And I guess this is the secret that we can use to make it look more realistic, right? So do I want to do that in geometry nodes or do I want to do that in shading? Well, I guess why not both? Okay, let me tell you what I'm thinking. I'm thinking they're kind of like circular kind of bumps. So I'm going to use a noise texture and you're like, or sorry, a Voronoi texture, and you're thinking, how's this related? Voronoi texture basically makes circles, as you can see. Such that if I'm to subtract, you can literally see those circles, right? And I'm thinking maybe we can use a map like this to kind of motivate what's going on, right? So maybe we send this through like a color ramp. Where it's black, we have the default color, and where it's white, we get kind of this like burnt look. We'll see. What does this look like? Is it any better? Okay, here we go. Now we're seeing the burned marks. So something like that. Make it deeper. I guess we can use the subtraction to kind of do this. So clearly, that is way too intense. Way too intense. But it is kind of capturing the spirit of it. So now the question is, how do we make this better? Well, it turns out that the new Voronoi texture 4.0, I believe, has detail and roughness sliders, which wasn't the case before. So if I bump up the detail, maybe not that much, and also the roughness, I'm hoping that this will generate a more organic pattern. Although at this point, it's starting to actually just kind of look like a noise texture. But it has like the Voronoi influence. So we have that, but I guess I also want this to motivate the bump. So they're kind of corresponding. So maybe I can add this here. A little hard to tell. Without, with, that's not bad, okay? But we can set that to ease. You know, that looks burnt in a good way. Okay, that seems to be the secret. Other than subsurface, which is failing me a little. But that seems to be pretty good. One thing I'm noticing is the cheese. So now we're in the tweaking land. The cheese looks very dark. Can I bring up the color? Maybe not by that much, but maybe by 20%. Okay, that looks better. Pepperoni looks a little too toxic. I know what I said, but it's a little too toxic. Bring down the saturation just a touch. And maybe bring the hue. Yeah, that seems like a more accurate color. And again, the limiting factor seems to be the crust. Well, I think one issue is where the cheese transitions into crust. There's not much happening there. They're just kind of like overlapping shapes. So we should have one affect the other. So in the cheese, I'm going to use a special little trick called ambient occlusion. Why does this matter, right? When two objects touch, it increases ambient occlusion. It's kind of like a shadow in a sense. Why does this matter? Well, if you look at our ambient occlusion map, not easy to see yet, but we can bump it, it exactly outlines what is underneath the pepperoni, and also, this is so stupid, and what is near the crust. More so, if you have a normal map, which I guess we don't, you can also plug it in here to get extra detail. So what I'm thinking is now we can drive the color using this. I don't really know what I want to do with it. First of all, I want to invert this. And make it a little less intense. So we've isolated the boundary. I want to use this to change the color. So you can see what that's doing, right? What color would we want? So obviously it should be a shade of red, but maybe it should be this kind of burnt thing, or should it be brighter? And you can actually bring it above 1. No, definitely not that. And this will kind of get rid of the green a little, visibly. Okay, so that's adding something. More saturation, more brightness. So this is without and with. Okay, so that's definitely a useful trick that blends everything together. But could we do the same thing with the crust? And by the way, you can also bring up the distance on this. Could we do the same thing with the crust? Let's see. So I go to crust, I paste these nodes. What does this look like? Kind of similar. And maybe we can also kind of get this burnt effect. So I need to think it through, but I either want to add or subtract this effect. So let's see. If we add it, I think that's what we want. If we subtract it, no, add it. Okay, good. It's too much, but it is working. So to make it softer, clearly I need to bring this down, I believe, set this to ease. I think just the color of the burning might be too intense, but it's good, right? Like it's doing something for me. Something like that. Maybe increase the saturation. This is where it gets a little difficult, to be honest with you. Right? Like what makes something look like dough? I guess there's probably too much bump here. It's going to be a little difficult. But we're clearly, look at that. Look at that pizza. We're clearly getting somewhere. Do I want to add puffiness to our crust? I'm going to say yes. I didn't do this in the original. So this is our, no, we don't want the cutout. This is our boundary. I just want to puff it up a little. Let's see how much geo we have. Not much. So let's run this through a subdivision surface. That will add more geometry and make it a bit smoother. Maybe I can use kind of the same idea as before with the Voronoi. I guess these should be linked to each other, just like the height map was. But let's see. I'm going to take a Voronoi texture. Let's view what that looks like. I'm going to take a Voronoi texture, bring up the scale, and try to do the same kind of thing, but this time to increase the puffiness. So this can be thought of as our puff map, if you will. Puff, puff, pass. Okay. And then in these areas, to make it puffy, that's actually pretty simple. All I need to do is kind of expand it, which is another word. In other words, it's basically moving it outwards by its normal. So it's expanding it, kind of extruding it by its normal. So this is what that looks like. Let's view that. So here I've expanded it clearly by a lot. But if I do this only for like certain areas, right? So I'm going to vector math. I'm going to scale this effect. So this is now controlling this. We connect this here. Make that less intense. Do I want to kind of just multiply this effect? I'm trying to make it weaker. Yeah. Clamp that so nothing can get tiny. That seems to kind of be what we want, at least, right? Clearly the shape is wrong. What's actually happening under the hood is wherever there's a bump, it's going to make a linear. It's going to make a linear kind of curve, I think. So we can actually just kind of smooth this out with a map range and just set this to smoother step. I mean, that's kind of better. Maybe we just need more geo. And to make it, I mean, clearly this is roughly the idea. So let's see. I'm going to get rid of the viewer node. Okay. We got the puff. Could we also do this on the pizza, the cheese? Maybe. let's see. We can kind of copy this situation. I set position by the same thing. It's a little hard to tell. But yeah, that now has the puff. I don't know. I think that's better. We're getting closer to it. Now, another thing to note is now I'll start making the box. This, of course, needs to be kind of put in context, right? It looks fake, better than it did before for sure. But that is partly because it's kind of just floating in space, right? There's no context. You'd never see pizza floating in space. Not in my experience anyways. So I'm going to make a pizza box. And another thing you can do, of course, to make this look better is add different toppings, etc. And maybe like grease areas. But I'm going to do a box. Okay, so I'm going to extrude upwards, delete this face, and maybe we can have this thing be open. Right, something like that. Bring these downwards. I'm not going to make the full box, just something like that. What happened to our pepperoni? Okay, so I think I figured it out. It seems like this is in part driven by this normal map, which makes it not as intense, this effect. But it's also just straight up the color. So I guess by changing these two things, we can soften the blow a little. So I'm going to bring down the strength, just so I keep some of that nice normal mapping. And that's great. I mean, honestly, this is done. The only thing I'm seeing, pepperoni intersection. Wee-oo, pepperoni intersection. We could fix that, or we could be lazy and just kind of change the seed until we get something that we like. Yes, I guess the main thing I've learned from recording this tutorial is that subsurface has a little bit of danger to it. Well, I guess could I just bring the pepperoni up just a smidge? Yeah, I can. Okay, now it's not intersecting. It's floating a little, but you can't tell. Okie dokie. That's a pizza. And notice, we haven't even gone into compositing or anything yet. This is just kind of like a raw render, if you will. Okay. So, we've made the Blender pizza. It's beautiful. Honestly, if somebody made a pizza like that, that'd be great. I was just thinking, there's something I left out. Okay. Last thing. You know, you're getting my whole spiel. I think one interesting thing to do is to actually cut this into eighths or sixths or whatever, just to get that extra boost of intentionality, or like somebody actually thought this through. Okay, to keep this super simple, this is the cutout that survives, right? So if I want to cut into the cutout, we need to do it here. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to take a gradient texture. We'll view it right here. So this is a gradient texture. I'm going to set this to radial, which will make it go between 0 and 1 for the angle. So you're going to see what I'm doing in a second. If I take this and I multiply it by, let's say, 8 for 8 slices, and then run it through a fraction, we get slices, right? What's happening here is the gradient texture goes from 0 to 1 as we go clockwise or counterclockwise or whatever. I'm now saying go between 0 and 8, and by making it a fraction, we go between 0 and 1 8 times. It only keeps the decimal part. And this, again, is not centered, just like some of the other issues. So I can just kind of shift that over. Don't need to be too stressed about that. What was I saying? This kind of represents our slices, but we could do even better. We could process this through something like a greater than node, which will let us kind of make these slivers. I guess in this case, it's less than. So instead of doing this in geometry nodes, which might be a bit, we could just kind of do this straight up in shader nodes. So to do that, this is also something I want to store. So I want to store this attribute. I'm going to call it cuts. And then finally, You could do this on the crust and on the cheese and everything, but I'll just do it on the cheese. On the cheese, I'm going to bring in the cuts attribute. Looks like that. And all I want to do is I want to motivate the normal map a little. So do this, do that, view it. Is it visible? It's not very visible, is it? Okay, there we go. We have to bring up the strength. Okay, so make that a little gentler, like the person didn't cut all the way through. That looks pretty good, doesn't it? Could we also do it on the crust? Let's just do it. We're almost done anyways. Okay. It should kind of be the same principle. In fact, why not just do it at the end here when everything's combined? That might be the way. Okay, so now we have the cuts attribute. Is it still? Yes, it's still affecting our pizza. I'm going to copy this over into the crust, which I guess already has a normal map. So I'm just going to add this component. And now it's a little subtle, isn't it? So I'm just going to scale it up. Yeah, it's hard to see, but I think we do actually have cuts in our pizza. Yeah, I need to bring up the strength, unfortunately. So I guess if I bring up the strength, I need to counteract this by, one second, by bringing down kind of this like noise thing. So let's see. What is going on here? Okay, there we go. 0.1, too much. Divide by 2, too much. Divide by 2, too much. Divide by 2. There we go. So now we have kind of the look of our original crust with the cuts going all the way through. And just to really emphasize it, we're finishing up, don't worry. I'm going to mix the color with this as the map. So now we're really outlining this. And I'm just going to darken it a little. Darken it a little, but make it not really visible. I know that they're like too thick, but that's kind of a function of the radial thing. We could fix it, but honestly, let's finish up. So it's subtle, but I think it will emphasize it. And then again, same for the cheese, which won't be subject to as much distortion. Basically, they're radial rays, so you would expect them to grow in size almost, but neither here nor there. So I'm just going to kind of darken it just to really emphasize this. Really, it would just kind of be like normal mapping, but I think it will like subtly increase this. Okay, pizza tutorial. We're done. Okay, so if you enjoyed this tutorial and you want the Blender file, this one in particular, hard to make, you can go over to my Patreon and you get access to, what do you get? You get every blend file, including this one, that I've made over the past 5 years. I would argue that this one in itself is worth $5, but you also get a few hundred more blend files as well. Early access to tutorials. I just uploaded one the other day that was early access, exclusive tutorials I made in the past. Check it out. It's the best direct way to support what I do and also get something in return. See ya.